Okay, I just want to first thank everyone for joining me today. My talk will focus on cycling, cognitive performance, and brain activity in adolescents with attention deficit disorder or ADHD. Just a little background to start us off. Next slide, please. So many of you are very familiar with the fact that ADHD is the most common neurodevelopmental disorder, and that it affects approximately 6 million children and adolescents in the US. The diagnosis of ADHD is based on the presence of inappropriate levels of inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, and is typically accompanied by impairments in executive function domains, such as attention and working memory. Behavioral interventions are frontline treatments for individuals with ADHD, and specifically exercise, both acute and chronic, has been shown to improve executive function and other associated symptoms. However, there is limited information regarding the underlying mechanisms involved in the cognitive benefit of exercise in individuals with ADHD, and this knowledge gap has limited our ability to predict responses and provide individualized recommendations for parents and, for patients. Next slide, please. So today we will focus on 3 different investigations that aim to address this knowledge gap. For our first study, we investigated a dual task paradigm using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or NIRS. And the aim of this first study was to compare task-related brain activity and cognitive performance during moderate intensity cycling exercise in adolescents with and without ADHD. And the hypothesis was that during cycling exercise, greater improvements in brain function and cognitive performance would be observed in the ADHD group compared to a seated rest control condition and a typically developing group. Next slide, please. So near-infrared spectroscopy was used to measure brain activity during 2 concurrent tasks, which consisted of performing a working memory and attention task while cycling indoors on a stationary bike. Here we chose to focus on executive function domains of working memory and response inhibition because they are among the most common cognitive symptoms experienced by individuals with ADHD. And as Dr. Reiss mentioned earlier, the NIRS device uses infrared light to measure the concentration of oxygenated hemoglobin, which is a proxy measure for brain activity. And so with this technology, we're able to measure brain activity at the cortical surface through the application of light sources and detectors on the scalp. And due to the coupling of neuronal metabolism and oxygen delivery in the active brain regions, we're able to measure changes in both oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin, and these are indicated in the graph in the center by the red and blue tracings. Next slide. So working memory was assessed using the visual spatial NBAC task with 3 different versions. In each version, a circle would appear in one of 16 different locations. And for the 0-back condition, participants were instructed to press a response button anytime the circle on the current screen was in the upper right location. For the 1-back condition, participants were instructed to press the button anytime the circle on the current screen was in the same location as the previous screen or the one before location. And for the 2-back location, participants were instructed to press the button anytime a circle on the current screen was in the same location as the screen 2 before. So for individuals with ADHD, problems with working memory often manifest as frequently forgetting to do things, such as following instructions or completing homework assignments. Next slide. Next, the go-no-go task was used as our measure of inhibitory control. And for this, participants were instructed to press a response button for every letter except the letter X. For individuals with ADHD, again, problems with inhibitory control often manifest as sudden interruptions during conversations, trouble waiting their turn, or difficulty staying on task. Next slide. This figure shows the overall time course for the study and was designed to capture the cognitive effects in response to a very short duration exercise bout. So for this study, participants were aged 10 to 18, and 15 adolescents with ADHD and 23 typically developing adolescents were tested. Participants came in for 2 study visits. On one day, they completed the exercise plus cognitive task session, shown here at t=0 in red. And then on the other day, they completed a session of the cognitive task, resting on the bike without pedaling. So that's our seated rest control condition, and that's represented at t equals 0 in blue. And these sessions were randomized and counterbalanced. And then following the exercise or non-exercise condition, the cognitive tasks were repeated again at 1 hour and 2 hours post. So for the exercise session specifically, participants were instructed to do a 5-minute warm-up at a low intensity, followed by 25 minutes of moderate intensity cycling. And that was defined as 65% of age predicted heart rate max. And then they finished the cycling with a 5-minute cool down. And then each cognitive task was approximately 10 minutes in length, with a 2-minute rest in between each of the tasks, with again, the order being counterbalanced. Next slide. So for the second aim of this project, that focused on determining the short-term effects of moderate intensity cycling on the task-based brain activity and cognitive performance in the adolescents with and without ADHD. So this aim focused on analysis of the data collected at the 1 hour and 2 hour post-exercise or post-seated rest time points. And for this aim, the hypothesis was that following exercise, greater improvements in brain function and cognitive performance would be observed in the ADHD group compared to the seated rest control condition and the typically developing group. Next slide. So in terms of results, I'll just be highlighting 3 of our main outcomes for today. So for aim 1, which again focuses on the comparison of cognitive performance during cycling to cognitive performance during seated rest, we used linear mixed effects models and found a significant main effective group. So this indicates that slower response speeds for the ADHD group were observed compared to the typically developing group for both the go, no go and end-back tasks, so regardless of condition. And the lower response accuracy observed in the ADHD group during exercise here highlights how cognitive impairment could be amplified when adolescents with this condition are required to perform tasks involving both demanding mental and physical load. Slow response speeds have been observed across multiple executive domains in individuals with ADHD, and this may negatively impact the rate of learning, retrieval of information, problem solving, and also play a role in mental fatigue. Next slide, please. So for brain activity during the inhibitory task, a group by condition interaction was observed for a region encompassing the left inferior and superior parietal gyrus. So that's highlighted in yellow. So such that the ADHD group had lower brain activity during exercise compared to the seated rest condition, while the opposite was true for the typically developing group. And so the parietal region is a key area involved in top-down attentional control in association with other networks joining the prefrontal cortex and other areas. And this finding is interesting given that behaviorally no differences in inhibitory task performance were observed between exercise and control, although as I just mentioned, the ADHD group did have slower response speeds compared to the typically developing group. So since brain activity during exercise for the ADHD group essentially became more similar to that of the typically developing group, we can infer a shift towards a more normative allocation of neuronal resources in this region. Next slide, please. So then for the second aim, data analysis is still underway, but we're starting to observe some interesting trends. And so in this example, we observed a 3-way interaction across diagnosis, condition, and time point, also for the left parietal region during the inhibitory task. So in the figure at the right, the ADHD group initially shows lower activation during exercise, as just reported. So that's noted here as baseline. However, 1 hour post-exercise, the ADHD group shows an increase in activation in the exercise condition, while the typically developing group shows a relatively consistent activation across both conditions and time points. So that's indicated by the relative flat lines there. For performance on the inhibitory control task, which I don't have that graph on this particular slide, but the ADHD group had lower response accuracy compared to the typically developing group for all time points, and that was similar between conditions, while the typically developing group had slightly higher response accuracy at 1 hour and 2 hours post-exercise compared to the seated rest condition. So together, these findings suggest that performance of the physical and mental tasks in concert is challenging for adolescents with ADHD, and the effects may persist at 1 hour post-exercise. But the shift in brain activation to a higher level at 1 hour post-exercise highlights the general adaptability of this specific parietal region. So this is particularly important because the parietal region is often found to be hypoactive in individuals with ADHD when compared to typically developing individuals. And future testing aimed at single task designs will provide additional context for this study and also help us unpack how exercise may continue to modulate neuronal resources. Next slide. So lastly, our current project, we wanted to examine brain activity in a more naturalistic setting, as Dr. Reiss had mentioned. So the design is to really mimic how a person cycles in their everyday life, such as commuting to work or school or riding for enjoyment outdoors. And so our purpose was to determine the relationships between executive function, cognitive load, and brain activity before, during, and after exercise in individuals with varying levels of ADHD symptoms. And so in this context, the cognitive load refers to the mental demand, engagement, or stimulation as a result of the exercise bout and has been a critically important yet overlooked phenomenon. The cognitive load in this case is manipulated by having participants cycle both indoors and outdoors. Next slide. So for this study, we're enrolling adolescents and young adults aged 13 to 22 with varying levels of ADHD symptoms. Our goal is to recruit a well-stratified cohort of adolescents with respect to attentional focus by enrolling approximately 1/3 of our participants meeting criteria for ADHD, 1/3 with subclinical symptoms, and then 1/3 without symptoms. And this is really important because achieving a sample with a continuous distribution of ADHD symptoms more likely reflects the true population distribution of the disorder. So for this design, participants attend 3 experimental sessions where we measure brain activity using NIRS before, during, and after the high and low cognitive load conditions and a quiet rest control condition. So the low cognitive load condition will consist of cycling indoors on a stationary trainer, which is very typical for exercise research. And then the high cognitive load condition consists of outdoor cycling along a nature path. And that was shown in the video by Dr. Reiss earlier. Lastly, the quiet rest control condition consists of seated rest watching a nature video. And then the NBAC and go, no go tasks will again be our cognitive function tasks, which are completed before and 10 minutes after each condition. The exercise session is 25 minutes in duration and is at an intensity of 65 to 75% of age predicted heart rate max. And daily physical activity habits are also being measured by having participants wear an activity tracker around their waist for 1 week in between their 2 test days. And to date, 11 participants have completed all 3 visits, and we are really excited to continue testing over the course of the next year. Next slide. And so finally, as we move forward through the recruitment and testing phase of the current study, we plan to expand upon this work in the future by examining how daily levels of physical activity and sedentary behavior interact with the acute responses to exercise, both in terms of brain activity and cognitive performance. And we also aim to expand upon the naturalistic design by testing different exercise durations and intensities within both of these contexts, because direct comparisons of different exercise dosages will be essential to aid in prescriptions in the future. And then we ultimately aim to use the data obtained from the acute dose response studies to design exercise training trials to test more of the longitudinal aspects of both cognitive and brain function adaptations. Next slide. And with that, I'd like to thank Dr. Reiss and all of the wonderful staff at the center for helping us work through our testing and recruitment and work with participants. Of course, I thank the participants and families who have participated in our studies. And we've had a number of undergraduate assistants as well. Next slide. And if anyone is interested in participating in a study or highlighting our work in any way, please feel free to just contact me directly. And then I've also listed our center website in case you'd like more information about your work, or our work. But with that, I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Riper, for a really interesting and informative talk. We have a few minutes for questions. So again, in the audience, feel free to submit those questions via Whova or via Zoom, and we will make sure we get them answered. So my first question here is just, thinking about the inside versus the, outside cycling, and how unique of an experience that must be for your participants. How have they enjoyed that component of your research so far?
Yeah, it's been a really fun experience to hear, the anecdotal comments of the participants being made, and so many of them that cycling outdoors is their favorite part of the whole study. And one thing I failed to mention is that we're actually also measuring mood pre and post exercise. We'll have levels of tension, anxiety, and so forth. And a lot of the young adults have said, I feel better. Why do I feel better? And I have to withhold a lot of my comments till after their final study visit. But they're very curious and very excited about the work that we're doing and already seem to notice how the differences occur.
Yeah, that's so great to hear. And I know, there's something special about, riding through that Stanford campus as well. So beautiful place to be able to ride. Another question going back to the first study, I know this might be one of kind of the few studies that actually looks at activity during cycling. And so, were you surprised at what you found in kind of those differences in those with, ADHD and the typically developing controls in terms of that brain activity during cycling?
Yeah, so it's certainly a very interesting paradigm because oftentimes, like Dr. Reiss mentioned, we have this pre-post measurement, and a wealth of literature shows that immediately after exercise or up to 10 minutes, certainly some longitudinal studies have had hours of post-exercise benefit on cognition, mood, and other outcomes. But this dual task design is really different in terms of trying to maximize essentially the measurements that we can obtain with the brain imaging device. And so if we think about asking participants to do two things at once, which is challenging for any person, both a physical load and a mental load, it really appears from the data that this sort of demanding nature of dual tasking can exacerbate some of the symptoms that we see. And so it was a very curious finding because in my mind, we can think of perhaps the typically developing group as having a relatively stable response and perhaps the ADHD group to have more room to move in terms of improvement or decrement. And so it will be very interesting to see how this next study where we have more pre-post measurements can actually complement the dual task study that is the main part of the data that I presented today. So.
Super interesting. And we've got time for one more that came in from online. And they said, I know you're still kind of early in the investigations, but do you have any thoughts about the exercise dose with consideration for the CDC guidelines of, physical activity and how that interfaces with brain health?
So we really designed the duration and intensity based on several meta-analyses. And so that 25 to 35 minute duration has really been shown to optimize the effects of exercise. And so that's why we're timing our post-cognitive measurement 8 to 10 minutes post-exercise, because that's where the literature says that the greatest benefit from an acute bout appears to be located. Certainly, one of the things that really needs to be tested is how different dosages and different follow-up time points map in terms of how long the benefits last and that sort of thing. But in terms of guidelines, that's why we're also measuring physical activity behaviors, both light, moderate, and vigorous with our activity trackers, as well as sedentary behavior, because both of those are independent outcomes in terms of both brain health and cognition. And so that's a really interesting angle of the study to help see, do those that meet ACSM recommendations for physical activity actually have better outcomes in terms of the acute response to exercise or not? So yeah, very important questions, and we've thought very carefully about how to include that.
Great. Well, thank you both so much for your presentation. And I'm sure there might be more questions coming in for the audience, and we'll be sure to forward those along to you. So thank you both.